Hello everybody, welcome to what should be the second video on my YouTube channel. Here I'll be going through, in today's video, I'll be going through a mock interview question for Cambridge and Oxford economics. And this is going to be an extract based interview question. And this is a really common interview question type. There's probably about a 70% chance you'll get sent an extract, and if you do, then probably a third or so of your interview will be devoted to that extract. So it's a pretty significant part of your interview. So they're really worth preparing. Now, for those of you who haven't watched the first video or kind of skipped the intro, this video is part of a series that I'm doing on interviews, and it's part of a wider Oxbridge preparation video set that I'm doing. And I'll be putting a few of those on YouTube, but this is going to take me probably several hundred hours. So most of them are going to go on my Patreon, where for a relatively small fee, you can get access to kind of all my knowledge that I've built up whilst doing lots of tutoring over the years. So it's the sort of stuff that would have really helped me, and hopefully you'll see that in this interview question. So if you enjoy it, please do have a look at my Patreon. So that's got loads and loads, like literally there should be about, by the end, 70 or 80 videos going over this sort of thing. Right, so just to start, this is going to be on the EU Emissions Trading Scheme, ETS, and we're going to discuss the following extract. So it's here, and I've also linked it below in the, I don't know what you call it, in the title or in the comments. So before you watch this video, could you please take half an hour out, don't rush it because you'll waste this extract. Read through the extract really carefully, perhaps print it off, and also you can spend that half an hour also reading a bit online about emissions trading schemes and getting a bit of general awareness, because what I'm hoping is you'll go through this video, you'll see the question, pause the video, then you'll provide an answer or think about an answer, or even better, record yourself giving an answer like I'm recording myself now. And then after that, I've got a few, if it's a more complicated question, I'll give a hint, and then perhaps a second hint, and then perhaps a third hint, and then an answer. And after each hint, if that hint's useful, re-record yourself, just because then it best mimics an actual interview. Because in an actual Cambridge interview, the key is, or an Oxford interview, the key is you're not going to get the correct answer straight away, or you're highly unlikely to. The interviewer is likely to guide you along the way. So I've tried to imitate that by giving hints for what I think would be regular pitfalls or confusions. Obviously that does make it harder than a normal interview because my advice isn't personalised to you, but hopefully you'll still get the gist. So my first question is more straightforward. Could you explain how an emissions trading scheme operates? Right, so now pause the video and perhaps record yourself, and then I'll give you the answer. Okay, yeah, so this is just a sort of introductory question. It's not asking too much. The answer that I would give is that the government sets a fixed cap on the number of allowances, on the level of emissions. So that might be, I don't know, 100 million tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. Then to kind of distribute this cap, they create 100 million allowances. And then you buy an allowance which gives you the right to emit that, I don't know, tonne of carbon dioxide. Then this is kind of a fixed supply, which is then auctioned to the private sector, which then means that the price that you pay for this allowance is essentially the cost of emitting carbon. As simple as that. Right, so my next question is, how does the presence of financial firms like banks and hedge funds, who are not required to hold allowances, influence the overall functioning of the carbon market? Right, so pause here. And again, this is a simpler question. I'll be getting into more complicated questions later on. Okay, so my first hint, and in fact my only hint, is think about the following factors. First is prices. So how is the presence of financial firms operating in the market? This referring back to that extract, recall. So think about what they said in the extract. How is that going to affect price in the market? How is it going to affect liquidity in the market? And how is it going to affect volatility in the market? Right, now going through all of these, clearly if firms are buying up allowances, or if financial firms are buying up allowances, then that's going to increase the demand for carbon, right? Which is going to push the price up. So fairly straightforward. If they're buying carbon, you can just draw it on a supply and demand diagram. That's going to push the price up. Now, in terms of liquidity, these financial firms will be more sensitive to deviations in price, which means the market will get more liquid. But as soon as there's an increase in demand for some reason, these financial firms will be more willing to sell, whereas a manufacturing firm which has planned a certain amount of output, I don't know, an amount that will produce 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide, so they bought up 10,000 allowances. If the price moves by, I don't know, 5%, if they've already planned this manufacturing, if they've already got the raw materials ready, then they're not just going to cancel it and sell these allowances on. So it makes the market more liquid. Then in terms of volatility, it's actually quite ambiguous. But there's kind of two contrasting forces. So the first is what we basically just talked about. If there's a sudden change in price, then these guys can step in, give liquidity to the market, and therefore reduce volatility. But then operating the other way, you have that these firms are less likely to respond to kind of deep fundamentals, which means that the things that they respond to can change faster. So think about a manufacturing firm. They'll plan their output for the year, which means if there's some small change, I don't know, a change in government policy, their plan for output might not change that much, which means their demand for allowances won't change that much. Whereas a financial firm, if there's a change in policy, I don't know, they find out that the annual amount that the number of allowances is reduced by is reduced, i.e. that there will be more allowances in future compared to what they expected. All these financial firms will react very quickly. So yeah, that's kind of the summary. Right, question 3. We're getting a little bit more sophisticated here. In the extract, it's mentioned that higher carbon price is generally accompanied by higher consumer prices. Why is this? Right, so my hint for you is make sure to consider multiple channels with causality flowing either way. But when I've asked this as a practice interview question live, most of the time people identify one channel, but there's really 2 key channels here. Now here's my answer. The likely answer that you gave, and the one that I've come across most of the time, is that higher carbon prices mean higher costs for firms, which mean higher prices for firms, which means higher prices for consumers, right? While that is a good point, I don't think it's the primary channel. I think that's more of a secondary channel, that higher carbon prices lead to higher prices. I think the main way that this system will operate is almost the reverse, which is, well, what's causing higher... we can see that carbon prices and prices are correlated. So when I say price, I mean prices across the economy. We can see that they're correlated. So is it possible that it's almost the higher price across the economy which are causing the higher carbon prices? And well, yes. If you think about, well, what's causing those higher prices across the economy, it's likely to be some sort of boom in demand, right? Except recently, generally when we've seen inflation, it's because demand is really, really strong. I don't know, think about 2006 or so. When demand suddenly shoots up, we see more inflation. Now, when demand suddenly shoots up, there's also going to be demand suddenly shooting up in the industries which heavily use carbon allowances. Now, I can't remember, but I'm not sure if the EU ETS was set up in 2006, But in 2006, if it was, you would have seen that cement is really carbon heavy. So when the house building sector was booming, which is pushing up prices generally in the economy because the economy is booming, there's also going to be a massive increase in demand for cement, say, which will lead to an increase in demand for allowances. So it's kind of that the factors which are causing the higher price in the economy will also contribute to higher carbon prices. So there's these two kind of contrasting factors which are leading to this. And for me, I think the more convincing one is the second one, because when you compare the size of the carbon market to the size of the overall EU economy, you'll see that the carbon market makes up a very small share of costs for firms. So an increase in carbon, yes, is going to lead to some degree of higher prices across the economy, but I don't think it's sufficient to say that it will lead to kind of noticeably higher prices. Now, question 4. We're getting more and more sophisticated, so do stick around to the end because the best questions come at the end. But the EU emissions trading scheme system is essentially a cap and trade system. Now, how does this differ from a Pigouvian tax in terms of its effectiveness and potential implications for the environment and economy? Which one is better, is essentially what I'm asking. So think carefully about that, and then when you're ready, I'll go on to the next hint. So my first hint is when you have a comparison of two things, the key is to first say how they differ, and then to think about, well, how do those differences affect outcomes? So first think to yourself how they differ. Right, my second hint is the key difference between these two things is that the EU emissions trading scheme, or just an ETS, will control quantity, right? It's the government saying you can only emit 100 million tonnes of carbon. And then the price for that, or for per unit quantity, is based off this. It's almost like a monopolist either decides price or quantity, right? Whereas by comparison, a tax controls price, and then the quantity of emissions is set based off this. Now, that's an important difference. So just have a quick think about how that's going to affect outcomes. Now, here's the overall answer. Controlling the price may be beneficial because we can set price equal to marginal cost. Now I say can because it's pretty hard to know exactly what, the marginal external cost. It's pretty hard to know exactly what the marginal external cost is. But if we can do that, then we can achieve the efficient level of production. Now there's also predictability in the market, and I think this is quite a major one. If you have a really varying price, as you do in the emissions trading scheme, it makes it really hard for firms to plan. So normally they'll have to do what's called hedging. They essentially buy their contract in advance, but they'll pay a fee for this, and that fee is essentially just waste due to risk. Now, by comparison, the emissions trading scheme, which is controlling quantity, that control of quantity may be beneficial because we're certain of our emission levels. We're not going to have a boom year where all of a sudden we thought we were going to have 100 million tonnes of emissions, but actually we have 200. Then next, arguably with emissions, the marginal external cost is unmeasurable. Kind of how do you measure the cost to future generations? You're going to have to discount it, but what's the discount rate? That small change in the discount rate will massively affect. How do we even predict the costs? Because you've got kind of catastrophic events which happen at certain levels, such as I believe there's some sort of wind system which brings hot air to England from the Americas or something like that. And at a certain level of temperature, so if we emit a certain level, that breaks down. And all of a sudden that trigger will cost England huge amounts because all of a sudden we become just as cold as if you go across in the map, you'll see that I think we're in line with more like the lower parts of Canada instead of we have a fairly warm climate for where we are in the on the globe. So yeah, the marginal cost it's really hard to know in this example. It's not like, I don't know, a sewer firm or a sewage firm that's emitting into a river and it takes a certain cost to clean up and we can just figure out what the cost of cleanup is and just tax that. It's not like that. Then a third benefit is that you can give allowances out for free. Now, if you've read the article really carefully, you'll have come across this. Essentially, there's something called carbon leakage, which is where when a country imposes strict regulations on emitting, firms move out of the country, right? They, instead of abiding by that regulation, they move out of the country, move to a country with less regulations, and in fact might emit even more. Now, you can't really avoid that with a tax, but with a emissions trading scheme, you can just give those firms that are likely to move free allowances, and they can still sell them on, they can still sell them back, but it means that that they won't leave the country. Right, my next question is, and this is kind of one of my favourites here, I think, because I think it's really tests your understanding. Are rising carbon prices a good thing for the environment? Are rising carbon prices a good thing for the environment? I really do think about this. Now, my first hint is that there's a tendency to go wrong. People tend to just rush and say yes, and I'm not necessarily saying that yes is wrong, but don't just rush in and say yes, well, higher price of carbon, that sounds like it's a good thing. First, draw a supply and demand curve for this market. Draw the supply and demand curve for this market and think about it carefully. Now, my second hint is that the key here is that supply is vertical. Supply is fixed. That's the point in a cap and trade. You've capped supply. And this is a really, really regular thing to go wrong on. So don't worry if you have gone wrong on it. In fact, by really, really regular, I mean, I think about 2 or 3 people that I've done practice interviews for have got it right. So if you have got it right, give yourself a tap on the back. So if supply is vertical, as in any market, there's 2 ways that price can rise. Either supply can fall or demand can rise. So consider those 2 possibilities separately and think about what happens to total emissions and whether or not it's a good thing for the environment. Now, if supply falls, then it's a good thing for the environment, almost certainly, because you'll see that supply curve shift inwards and you'll just see total quantity of emissions fall. Now, if demand rises, that's somewhere between bad and neutral, and we'll explore that in the next question. But the key is that there's no change in quantity, and that's just because supply is fixed. If you draw on a vertical supply, you'll see any level of demand as long as you're demanding a positive amount, you'll have the same quantity. Right, so now we've got an extension, question 5b, which is a bit of an extension to the previous question. Let's assume that the higher price is caused by an increase in demand and not by a change in change in supply. Let's assume we're in a given year where the supply for that given year is fixed. So consider the following. A, which is that only 50% of all emissions are covered by the ETS. This is true for the EU ETS. Essentially, only the larger firms are covered. Smaller firms, because it's quite costly in terms of administration to be in, smaller firms are essentially ignored. And B, carbon leakage is a possibility. Now, given both of these factors, will rising carbon prices be a good thing for the environment? Think carefully about that. Okay, my first hint for this is for part A, which is only part coverage. Consider how the demand for goods produced by firms not covered, i.e. those who don't have to buy the allowances, think about how demand for goods produced by those firms is likely to be affected. Now, part B is more straightforward, so I don't think I'll do any hints for that. Now, note for part A, there's likely to be an indirect and a direct channel. There's 2 separate channels, so if you've just thought about one channel, try to think of a second. But I think it will give a bit more depth to your answer if you can think of them both. Now we've got the answer. Direct channel, if you've got higher prices in the for the emissions trading scheme, if that's driven by higher demand for companies' goods, which is likely, think about it in a boom, right? Firms are facing high demand for their goods, so therefore they're buying more allowances. Then that's likely that the firms not covered by the emissions trading scheme will also see that higher demand. That will increase their emissions and therefore cause higher emissions, right? So yes, those in the market are fixed, but those outside of the market see the same higher demand and therefore higher emissions. And if you've got one thing that's fixed and one thing that's getting bigger, then there's an unambiguous increase in emissions, bad for the environment. Now then, there's also an indirect channel, which is that companies covered by the emissions trading scheme are now less competitive, right? If they're seeing higher costs, then they're less likely to be able to convince the customers to buy their goods, which means who are customers going to buy their goods off? Well, it's going to be the ones who aren't covered by the scheme, which means not only do the firms not covered by the ETS see an increase due to that direct effect, they'll also see an increase due to the indirect effect. And even though consumers are moving away from those covered by the ETS, there's no reduction in the allowance usage because, remember, that's fixed. Now, the answer to B is higher prices will lead to carbon leakage. That's again where firms move out of the economy, which means that emissions will be constant in the emissions trading scheme, but they'll be higher elsewhere. And since the emissions don't really respect borders, we're just going to see higher total emissions. Now, there's a couple of other aspects that you could have considered. For example, that higher price in the long run may incentivize more innovation, and there's other kind of more qualitative factors that you can consider. Right, question 6, we're getting towards the end, and this is, again, a quite sophisticated question. So go back to the extract and find the quote. Hopefully you've got it up on your laptop so you can just Control F. By contrast, the industrial sector, which is cushioned by free allowances, has seen little improvement. Now, when I read this article, that seemed to me to imply that the cushioning of these firms led to small amounts of improvement. Now, I'd like you to think about that statement. Would being given free allowances actually change a firm's behaviour? Why would they give allowances out for free? Now, actually, we've covered a bit of why they give allowances out for free. That's because of the carbon leakage, so ignore that part. Just think about, would being given free allowances change a firm's behaviour? Now, my first hint is there any type of cost for the firms getting free allowances of using these allowances? Is there any type of cost? Have a think about that. If you, like most people that I've interviewed, answered no to that question, you're wrong. So I ask it again. Is there any type of cost for the firm getting free allowances of using these allowances? Think really carefully. Any type of cost. My third hint is yes, there is. It's an opportunity cost, right? If you're using these allowances to produce, then you're not selling them, because that's the key to realise that if you're not using them, then you can sell them. How's that going to affect decisions? And my answer is the incentives are the exact same, right? If you're a firm that doesn't have these allowances, then you can either buy them or not produce. If you're a firm that does have these allowances, then you can either sell them for effectively the exact same price as you would have been able to buy them for, and not produce, or you can produce and not sell them. So the outcomes are the exact same, and I'm going to prove that mathematically in the next question. So yeah. Right, so question 7 is, can you model this to prove your answer to prove my answer from question 6? So in this, you should show that the conditions for the firm to be operating efficiently are the exact same regardless of if free allowances are distributed. Right, so my first hint is as follows. you want to set up the kind of profit maximization problem. And if you haven't come across this before, what you want to do is you want to get a formula for the profit that the firm is making in terms of the quantity. So here we've got two profits. We denote profit often as pi. So you've got pi n, where n is when the firm doesn't have any free allowances. So pi n is the profit of the firm without free allowances, and pi f is the same for that which is given free allowances. Now, for now, try and come up with your own symbols and set the rest of the problem up. Right, in this hint, I'll talk about the symbols that I'd use and the start of how to set up the problem. So first you want to denote P of Q as the price that consumers are willing to pay for Q units, that's per unit. So if the firm wants to sell 100 units, they might be able to sell them at £10 per unit. So I don't know, P of Q might be 110 minus Q. So there it would be £10 per unit if they want to sell 100 units, £5 per unit if they want to sell 105, and so on. Let C of Q be the cost of producing Q units. This is total cost, not including the cost of allowances. So I don't know, C of Q might be Q squared. So the cost of producing 10 units is 100. Let A be the number of free allowances given to a firm who receives free allowances. Obviously, a firm that doesn't receive free allowances just gets 0 free allowances. Let one allowance be used per unit of output. Note, you don't need this assumption to derive the result, but it just makes the maths a bit cleaner. Let Z be the cost per allowance. And yeah, try and set up the problem from here and show that the conditions for the firms to be acting optimally are the exact same. Right, here's my answer. The profits for the firm without free allowance are going to be P of Q times Q. That's just revenue, price times revenue, minus C of Q. That's just the profit normally, price, revenue minus cost. Then we've also got this additional cost, which is Z times Q, which is that the firm has to buy Z allowances per unit of output. So did I say Z allowance? I meant one allowance per unit of output, and the price of that is Z. So you know how I said that assumption wasn't really necessary, that it's 1 unit. That's because you could have some K where you need K allowances per unit of output, and you could then have ZKQ, and it'd be the exact same. Now for the firm that is given the free allowances, the only difference is they've only got to buy Q minus A allowances. So let's say A is 10 and Q is 20, they've only got to buy 10 allowances. If by comparison Q is 5 and A is 10, then they've only got, they can sell 5 allowances, so they actually generate revenue from this. Right, now if you differentiate with respect to Q, you get that pi dash I, where I can be equal to N or F, is equal to P dash Q times Q plus P of Q, that's just using the chain rule, minus minus C dash Q minus Z. That's the exact same for whichever one you differentiate, because the ZA is essentially a constant. So essentially, these free allowances are just the exact same as giving a payment worth ZA to the firm, right? That doesn't change its optimum behaviour. That is, unless there's a little bit of a nuance here. If free allowances are conditional on some level of production being reached, then they may have an effect. So consider a firm which it's optimal for it to shut down if it wasn't for the free allowances, but with the free allowances, it makes ZA minus some small loss that it was previously making. Now let's imagine that it only gets those free allowances if it produced a certain amount. Then that would lead to higher emissions, but that's kind of a nuanced case. Right. If you made it this far, well done. Just a reminder to check out my Patreon. This screenshot is literally, I couldn't fit them all in. I think I've got, in fact, let me check. I've got 75 interview questions planned, plus I'm not just doing interview questions, I'm also doing personal statement advice for how to prepare for the TMUA, and so on. And I'll be uploading a few of those to normal YouTube, but a lot of them I'll be keeping for Patreon, just because, recording this video took me about an hour, so that's just one of 100. So it will be taking a while for me. So yeah, please do check it out. And also do also check out my tutoring website. This is where I got all this experience from. If you do want more kind of personalised tutoring.